Hello, this is John Rhapsodies, bringing you a short Christmas story today from 1836 by Charles Dickens. Dickens walked the earth from 1812 to 1870 in England, and is best known today for his 1843 novella, A Christmas Carol, which has become perhaps the second most told Christmas story of recent memory. Today's story is called The Goblins Who Stole a Sexton, and was published in 1836 in the 29th chapter of the Pickwick Papers. Note: a sexton is someone in charge of maintaining a church and its grounds, including the cemetery, also called a churchyard. Hear the words of old. In an old abbey town, a long, long while ago, there officiated as sexton and gravedigger in the churchyard one Gabriel Grubb. He was an ill-conditioned, cross-grained, surly fellow, who consorted with nobody but himself and an old wicker bottle which fitted into his large, deep waistcoat pocket. A little before twilight one Christmas Eve, Gabriel shouldered his spade, lighted his lantern, and betook himself toward the old churchyard, for he had a grave to finish by next morning, and, feeling very low, he thought it might raise his spirits, perhaps, if he went on with his work at once. Grubb strode along until he turned into the dark lane which led to the churchyard, a nice, gloomy, mournful place into which the townspeople did not care to go except in broad daylight. Consequently, Grubb was not a little indignant to hear a young urchin roaring out some jolly song about a Merry Christmas. He waited until the boy came up, then rapped him over the head with his lantern 5 or 6 times, to teach him to modulate his voice. And as the boy hurried away, with his hand to his head, Gabriel Grubb chuckled to himself and entered the churchyard, locking the gate behind him. He took off his coat, put down his lantern, and getting into an unfinished grave, worked at it for an hour or so with right good will. But the earth was hardened with the frost, and it was no easy matter to break it up and shovel it out. At any other time, this would have made Gabriel very miserable, but he was so pleased at having stopped the small boy's singing that he took little heed of the scanty progress he had made when he had finished work for the night, and looked down into the grave with grim satisfaction, murmuring as he gathered up his things, "Brave lodgings for one, brave lodgings for one, a few feet of cold earth when life is done." "Ho, ho!" he laughed, as he set himself down on a flat tombstone, which was a favorite resting place of his, and drew forth his wicker bottle and said, "A coffin at Christmas. Ha! A Christmas box. Ho, ho, ho." "Ho, ho, ho," repeated a voice close beside him. "Ah, it was the echoes," said Gabriel, raising the bottle to his lips again. "It was not," said a deep voice. Gabriel started up and stood rooted to the spot with terror, for his eyes rested on a form that made his blood run cold. Seated on an upright tombstone close to him was a strange, unearthly figure. He was sitting perfectly still, grinning at Gabriel Grubb with such a grin as only a goblin could call up. "What are you doing here on Christmas Eve?" said the goblin sternly. I came to dig a grave, sir," stammered Gabriel. "What man wanders among graves on such a night as this?" cried the goblin. "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" screamed a wild chorus of voices that seemed to fill the churchyard. "What have you got in that bottle?" said the goblin. "Hollands, sir," replied the sexton, trembling more than ever, for he had bought it from smugglers, and he thought his questioner might be in the excise department of the goblins. "Who drinks Hollands alone, and in a churchyard on such a night as this?" asked the goblin. "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" exclaimed the wild voices again. "And who, then, is our lawful prize?" exclaimed the goblin, raising his voice. The invisible chorus replied, "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" "Well, Gabriel, what do you say to this?" said the goblin, as he grinned a broader grin than before. The sexton gasped for breath. "Well, what do you think of this, Gabriel?" asked the goblin. It's very curious, and very pretty," replied the sexton, half dead with fright. "But I think I'll go back and finish my work, sir, if you please." "Work?" said the goblin. "What work?" "The grave, sir," said Gabriel. "Oh, the grave, eh? Who makes graves at a time when other men are merry, and takes a pleasure in it?" asked the goblin. Again the voices replied, "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" "I'm afraid my friends want you, Gabriel," said the goblin. "Under favor, sir," replied the horror-stricken sexton. "I don't think they can. They don't know me, sir. I don't think the gentlemen have ever even seen me." "Oh, yes, they have," said the goblin. "We know the man who struck the boy in the envious malice of his heart because the boy could be merry and he could not." Here the goblin gave a loud, shrill laugh, which the echoes returned 20-fold. I'm afraid I must leave you, sir," said the sexton, making an effort to move. "Leave us?" said the goblin. "Ho, ho, ho!" As the goblin laughed, he suddenly darted toward Gabriel, laid his hand upon his collar, and sank with him through the earth. And when Gabriel had had time to fetch his breath, he found himself in what appeared to be a large cavern, surrounded on all sides by goblins ugly and grim. "And now," said the king of the goblins, seated in the center of the room on an elevated seat, "show the man of misery and gloom a few of the pictures we have from our great storehouses." As the goblin said this, a cloud rolled gradually away and disclosed a small and scantily furnished but neat apartment. Little children were gathered round a bright fire, clinging to their mother's gown or running around her chair. A frugal meal was spread upon the table, and an elbow chair was placed near the fire. Soon the father entered, and the children ran to meet him. As he sat down to his meal, the mother sat by his side, and all seemed happiness and comfort. "What do you think of that?" said the goblin. Gabriel murmured something about it being very pretty. "Show him more," said the goblin. Many a time the cloud went and came, and many a lesson it taught to Gabriel Grubb. He saw that men who worked hard and earned their scanty bread were cheerful and happy. And he came to the conclusion it was a very respectable sort of world after all. No sooner had the Goblin King formed it than the cloud closed over the last picture, which seemed to settle on Gabriel's senses and lull him to repose. One by one, the goblins faded from his sight, and as the last one disappeared, Gabriel sank to sleep. The day had broken when Gabriel awoke, and he found himself lying on the flat gravestone with the wicker bottle empty by his side. He got on his feet as well as he could, and brushing the frost off his coat, turned his face toward the town. But Gabriel was an altered man. He had learned lessons of gentleness and good nature by his strange adventures in the Goblin's Cavern. And that concludes the reading of The Goblins Who Stole a Sexton by Charles Dickens, published in 1836. This is John Rhapsodies. Thank you for listening, and Merry Christmas. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please subscribe, like, share, comment, and click the notification bell to help this YouTube channel grow. And remember, hear the words of old.